Welcome, everyone. We're really excited to have you guys all with us. We have a very large audience today, and we are really excited to bring this discussion to you guys. I'm Chris Schwartz. I'm a product manager with Pixalate. Today's discussion is going to be focalized to server-side ad insertion. We've appropriately titled this first slide, The Price of Anarchy in OTT and CTV, How Fraudsters Exploit Security Gaps in SSAI. We've gathered a great group of panelists. We have the IAB Tech Lab represented, as well as both the buy side and sell side. So we're very excited to bring this discussion to you guys. Just a few items to knock out right off the bat. At any point, feel free to raise any questions that you guys might have in the chat. We'll look to get to those at the end of the discussion today. And then we're also going to be making the recording of this available and a blog post recap available on our blog for everyone to view after the fact. So without further ado, I'll jump into it. The plan right off the bat is going to be a brief introduction from all the panelists that we have gathered here today, followed by a quick overview of Pixalate, who we are, what we do, some background context on what SSAI is, and also how we are defining OTT and CTV. So that said, let me turn it over to our panelists to introduce each of themselves. I'll turn it over to Amit, who's with the IAB Tech Lab. And for each of you, if you can, just give kind of a brief background of yourselves, your organization and your company, and we'll go from there.
Hi, this is Amit. Can you hear me okay?
Sound great, yep.
All right. Thank you, Chris. I'm Amit Shetty, and I head up the video and audio efforts at the IAB Tech Lab. This includes the video working group, as well as the OTT technical working group, which overall that covers things like VAS, VPaid, as well as OTT-specific challenges. We also have the TV convergence group, where we look across digital and broadband and find places where various industry groups can work together. The topic today, SSAI, is definitely very interesting to our members and has been a very high priority recently. In fact, a lot of the changes, the recent changes to the vSuite standards with VAS4, OMID, and CIMID have been driven by SSAI. And so that's the reason why I'm hoping that this conversation will help today's audience to get a better understanding of why it's important to upgrade to the latest specs. So I'm really happy to be on today.
And I am Ian Trider, Director Platform Operations at Centro. Centro's been around for 18 years now, helping agencies automate digital media. And our software platform basis is the only software solution of its kind to consolidate digital operations across programmatic, direct, search, and social campaigns. So my specific responsibilities are RTB integrations for our DSPs. That means exchanges and data providers, including fraud prevention.
Great, thanks, Ian. Hi, everyone. I'm Jeremy Smith, Vice President of Sales Engineering at Telaria. As you know, Telaria is a software platform to manage premium video advertising. We have a platform called a VMP, Video Management Platform, which provides a suite of tools to help all-screen video monetization. And we work with a number of partners that utilize SSAI, folks like Hulu, Sling TV, Fox, etc. My specific role at the company is to support our global sales force in all technical pre-sales activity, so helping them understand the use of our software, working with partners like Centro.
Thank you all for being with us today. And just to lay the groundwork here, overall, this discussion is really focused on thought leadership around server-side ad insertion, and that's why we've gathered these panelists here today. Each of them are experts in their fields, deal with this on an everyday basis, and are working internally and externally to deal with all of the considerations when it comes to server-side ad insertion, especially when it comes to OTT and connected TV. So just a little background on Pixalate. Overarchingly, we are a comprehensive cross-channel fraud management service. We maintain MRC accreditations, a series of MRC accreditations across each of these environments, including but not limited to viewability, fraud detection, sophisticated fraud detection, and so on and so forth. We maintain fraud monitoring, fraud blocking, and also brand safety solutions, which we make available to our clients. And we've also taken a great strides in the last couple of years, and the last couple of months in particular, in regards to OTT as well as server-side ad insertion in terms of our thought leadership. So I would encourage everyone on the call today to give our blog once over sometime, see what's out there. I know that there are posts that are put out each and every day, and particularly our focus as of late has been OTT, CTV, as well as server-side ad insertion. So I know everyone loves stats. So I'm not going to go through each of these in detail, but this is really just to lay the basis for any statistic that we are putting out there, whether it be in our blog or in the context of this discussion today. So we're currently monitoring over 15 app stores. That said, that's across 7,000 different apps and channels within the Roku store as well. In terms of how we're looking at server-side ad insertion, one thing to make clear right off the bat is we are making the distinguishment between what we call just generic SSAI and then transparent SSAI. When we say transparent in the context of our data and how we're looking at things, that really comes down to the information we're being passed, especially when it comes to the VAST protocols. And we'll dive into that a little bit deeper in the coming slides and discussion points. So now taking a step back and speaking holistically on how we define OTT and CTV. For us, OTT and connected TV really refers to internet-enabled TV. That said, we are making that determination on the basis of a device. I know that there are a lot of differing opinions that I've come across, and each entity is defining OTT differently to date, it seems. But for us, it's really on the device level. And we've worked very closely with the MRC as part of our OTT accreditations in making this determination and defining OTT, CTV as we do. So going into SSAI. So server-side ad insertion is an incredibly complex issue, but it's very simplistic at its core. So in traditional, what they call client-side ad serving, ad content and video content would be delivered separately, thereby enabling all traditional measurement as you would expect prior to server-side ad insertion coming out. The purpose, really the basis for why server-side ad insertion was founded and also is becoming quite prominent, especially in OTT and connected TV channels, is that it was on the basis of facilitating not only the user's overall experience in terms of latency, buffering, disconnects, etc., but also in terms of ad blocking. So with server-side ad insertion, both the ad content and the video content are delivered via a single stream. That's typically done while there are several different integrations for which this can be done. Typically, it involves being delivered by a proxy server, which in the context of this discussion today, I will likely refer to as an SSAI proxy server. And when that happens, often without the facilitations from frameworks such as VAST 4.0 and beyond, oftentimes you're completely reliant on the information being passed by the SSAI server. And in those cases, you would be getting an IP address that is not related to the user device whatsoever. And that has a lot of implications as well. Now, there's going to be a long list of items that we're going to dive into in our discussions today, but hopefully that lays the groundwork for really what SSAI is, and we can dive into it. So starting off the discussion, I'll start with Amit. What does SSAI mean for OTT and CTV? And what does it mean for you and where you stand in terms of the IAB Tech Lab? I'd love to get your opinion off the start, and then I'll turn it over to Ian and Jeremy to give their takes.
Sure. I guess that, well, since the IAB Tech Lab is an industry organization and not a product company, it means slightly different things for us. Basically, I think you covered the key drivers really for SSAI at least from a member's perspective, or what are the drivers for it, right? So device support, being able to support all the devices that don't have a client-side capability for ad insertion, quality of experience around delivering the best stream for any given device and bandwidth profile, and ad blocking, and arguably more than just ad blocking is a better and a lighter weight experience on the client side, right? So that I think is the main driver for it, and that's, I think, all three are, I think, important from an OTT point of view. And what it means for us is really from a standards perspective, it really has been all about cleaning up the standards in order to support SSAI. I mean, I think that most people have already had concerns around how VPaid works, the way it is a black box, the way it's it kind of wraps the video creative within itself and has all kinds of challenges because of that for streaming. And so that the biggest implication really has been that SSAI has been a big driver for the latest updates to our specs.
Absolutely, I appreciate that, and I know we'll dive into that, I believe, in the next question, actually. But one thing I should note is all of the data that is represented in our slide deck today, that is representative of our data based on Q2, and our data is widely open programmatic. That said, one of the points on this slide is that we are seeing incredibly high rates of SSAI in OTT and connected TV. It's becoming ever more prominent in our experience. And that's also something that I know the panelists today will speak to as well. But that said, I'll turn it over to Ian to get his take.
Sure. Well, there's no doubt SSAI is important to unlocking certain sorts of premium video inventory that is desirable to buy, either through real-time bidding or otherwise. My perspective is all about real-time bidding. And it's simply a technical necessity in certain cases, like insertion of ads into live TV streams. But there are certain implications. It means a shift from direct verification of the client device, even at least basic details, the IP address of the device that plays the ad, to a shift where a platform like a DSP essentially has to trust an intermediary server to tell it what that is. And that's a difficult to accept shift because of the trust issues in the programmatic ecosystem. So it's not so much that I'm concerned about supply where we know that it's a high-end, well-known broadcaster on Teleria, and they're using SSAI. That's all probably very straightforward. But in a more opaque or indirect supply chain, there's a real risk that I think should be of concern to those participating in the RTB ecosystem, where we're currently at a state in an industry where it's not particularly easy to distinguish a legitimate case of SSAI versus somebody simulating a case of SSAI. So that's a matter that I'm keeping a close eye on.
Yeah, and I think this is Jeremy. So I think for Telaria, we really sit between the buyer and the seller, right? So when we onboard our publisher partners onto our platform, they go through a pretty rigorous onboarding process where we ensure that if they're using SSAI, first we identify that in the platform so that we can expose it in the bid request so that we're fully transparent, but that we also ensure that they're passing the client-side information. So we know with SSAI, there's a need to use things like X forwarded for and X device to pass client IP and client user agent. And that's part of our onboarding process. So our DSP partners are getting that proper information. So we know it's something that more and more of our partners, specifically the VMVPDs, are utilizing to accommodate that user experience. And I think for our business, we try to be agnostic in the sense of the proxy partners, vendors that our publishers are using, and just be as transparent as possible with the buyers that are purchasing that supply.
Very great points from each of you. Very well put as well. I know the next question, moving on really to the standard side of things. Obviously there's been incredible work here, and I don't want to speak to it. I'd rather turn it over to the expert himself and get a meat steak on this in terms of what's been done, what's in the pipeline, and kind of where you see things heading in the future.
Sure. Definitely, I definitely love talking about this and can go on a bit. So there are a number of areas in the various working group efforts that have been driven by SSAI. Obviously, the three main specs come to mind that we've been working on recently: VAS4, Open Measurement, and CIMID. And I call this the new V-Suite, right? And I highly recommend that people look at it, not just for SSAI, but for a host of other reasons as well. And these three specs really cover the three main areas, if you will, in related to video ad serving, right? So the first is just purely first is delivery, second is measurement, and the third is interactivity. I know that the interactivity may not be a big focus of today's conversation, but it's something that I like to mention as well. From a delivery point of view, some of the changes in VAS4 that we made were around having a first-class node, if you will, for mezzanine files, which are very important for delivering high quality, actually the right quality of streams in your stitched streams, right? So basically, the mezzanine file is the highest quality creative file, and then you can transcode it to whatever is needed for a given user's profile. The second thing I would say is around that is the addition of a universal ad ID. This is more around, I think, around discipline and being able to track your creatives really and better handle them, especially in an SSAI environment. And probably the most important thing around this is the separation of the media file from executable code. And by the way, if you notice, when I was talking about the new V-Suite, I didn't mention VPaid. That's because we are basically replacing VPaid with Open Measurement and CIMID. The separation of the media file, and I think I mentioned that at the start as well, is actually very important because in order to stitch the stream, you really need to stitch the video creative into the stream. You need access to that video creative, and that was not possible with VPaid. And so that's one of the key changes that we've done with the VAS 4.x based stack. The second area is measurement, and I know that we're going to spend a lot of time on this as we go forward, so I'll just give some of the highlights here. The first, I think, is obviously Open Measurement, and this was a very important initiative originally driven by mobile, but is expanding to all the other platforms as well. And this is, I think, very relevant for MRC accreditation as well, to make that process easier by kind of taking care of some of the more common challenges around around measurement. The second area second topic in this area is around how to handle HTTP headers and macros in the various beacons when we are talking about SSAI use cases. And I'll hold off on that, since we will cover that as we go forward. A third and very important update is actually around ad requests. VAST historically has not had, it's been a response protocol, and we kind of left the request part of it to integrations, and that's something that has changed with VAST 4.x. And we have a lot of, it's a very simple macro-based implementation, but there are a number of macros that are relevant for SSAI, which will help the overall workflow, right? So kind of understand what the behavior is going to be in that response request workflow there, and which I think is going to be critical in reducing the vast errors that we have been seeing in the industry. I guess related to that, to what we're doing, and kind of actually, so the third area that we're working on, that we have worked on rather, is interactivity, as I mentioned. So CIMID, which is the Secure Interactive Media Interface definition, I know that's a mouthful, is the replacement of VPAID focused on interactivity. So VPAID has been replaced by OMID for measurement and by CIMID for interactivity. So that's the other piece that there. And the last part on interactivity is the concept of vast interactive templates, which I think is going to be, which is just a base, simple idea right now, but I think is going to be important as we go forward, because that allows for interactive experiences without having executable code. So those are the three areas that we've been working on: delivery, measurement, and interactivity. We do have a couple other conversations going on in the working groups right now, direction around how to handle bundle IDs and user agents in the OTT working group. I know that the ads.txt and app ads.txt is also going to be relevant, not necessarily SSAI, but I think for the OTT space as a whole. So those are the things that are going on right now.
Absolutely. And I know we are all, everyone on the call, and I'm sure everyone joining and attending today is very grateful for all the work that you guys do. So very much appreciated, and great to hear what's coming on the way as well. In terms of one follow-up question I wanted to ask was, in terms of adoption rates for VAST 4.0 and 4.1 and above. Do you guys have any insights? Are you guys getting much feedback in terms of adoption rates there overall?
Yeah, that's a great question. So basically, VAST 4.0, which was released, I know that a lot of people ask me about, oh, VAST 4.0 has been around for 2 years, and why have we not seen too much adoption there? And really has come down to the fact that 4.0 was kind of incomplete. We didn't have the interactive and measurement story there. So really, VAST 4.x, the way I look at it, the real VAST 4, if you will, was started off with VAST 4.1. Which was released last November, and we did release VAST 4.2 recently, but that was a very minor change to support CIMID. And so I've been actually seeing a lot of traffic, a lot of questions, and I can't name any companies yet, but I know that there are a number of companies that have been working on their VAST 4.1 and 4.2 implementations already. And so I expect to start seeing implementations kicking in the later half of this year. I suspect that it'll probably take a little while for people to get to the VAST 4.x stack, but I think that unlike if you think about VAST 3 and VAST 2, VAST 4 actually has a number of real drivers for that business drivers, I would say, for getting people onto that stack. So I'm pretty hopeful that we'll see a lot more come up.
That's great to hear. And just a reminder for everyone that's listening in today, you can submit your questions at any point, and we're going to hopefully have enough time at the end to address almost all of them. But just turning it over to the next question for the panelists. What reporting limitations do you guys consider exist when SSAI is used? I know we've kind of touched on a few different points, but then also how do you circumnavigate or address these challenges outright or through other means? And for this question, I did want to start with Jeremy, and then I'll work my way down to Ian in a minute.
Yeah, thanks, Chris. So I think there certainly can be a number of limitations depending on how the SSAI solution is implemented with various partners like SSPs. So one of the things that is a challenge often with SSAI is the concept of prefetching, where the server is requesting ads or a group of ads in advance of intended playback. So one of the things that we do, and we're speaking programmatically, is in the bid request, we communicate out that impression kind of time to live. So how long do we intend for the publisher, the server, to hold on to that ad before it's going to be played? One of the other things that we look at is, because we're kind of in a unique place where we see not only the impression pixel being fired, whether client-side or server-side, but we also see the request. So when we look at the request from the SSAI proxy, we then align that with the ultimate impression pixel. So we can make sure that the client-side information, again, IP and user agent, are both valid and match. So the other thing I think with that is it also depends on who's firing the pixels. So if the pixels are being fired server-side, I think that often leads to more of that kind of IVT situation where you're getting that server-side information and the client-side isn't getting passed through. I think it's a bit easier when the client side is firing the pixels, similar to more of a desktop mobile historical environment. So I think those are the types of challenges we see. One of the other things, lastly, that we've done is we've actually taken the concept of the SSAI flag from OpenRTB 3.0 and kind of retrofitted into 2.2.2.3, which is where most of our partners are integrated on, so that we can actually communicate in real time when SSAI is utilized. And not only that, but whether it's client-side or server-side from a pixel perspective.
That's great to hear. And Ian, I'll turn it over to you to get your take on this.
Sure. So setting aside the matter of fraud for a second, some things that a DSP has to worry about here are, a big one is, if the customer is using a third-party ad server, is it actually going to consume this information for server-side impression beacons? At least one very major ad server does not by default consume this information, and so that can create scenarios where a third-party ad server disagrees with the DSP and the SSP as to the geo of the impression, or might incorrectly flag it as fraud on the basis that the IP address that they recognize is the IP address that's literally making the request, the SSAI proxy. Otherwise, as I mentioned before, a reporting concern here is that, actually I should distinguish, because Jeremy mentioned the scenario of client-side versus server-side fired beacons. When all of the tracking events that tell the ad server and the DSP that an impression has happened and all the quartiles have happened, when those are fired client-side by the device, that's probably the best case scenario from my perspective. At least with regards to all the tracking metrics, they come directly from the device, and it behaves more or less exactly like everybody would expect a normal video impression to behave. It's when it's fired server-side that there's a lot more complication. So in that scenario, the ad server and the DSP essentially do have to trust that the SSAI server is not fabricating this information and is not, and is passing it correctly in the case where it's not just a total fabrication. So one of the primary ways we address these challenges today is that we apply a very high standard of, because we have to rely on business trust for the most part, we don't accept cases of what appears to be SSAI traffic, in other words, all of the beacons via server side, we don't accept that unless we have a very clear and transparent understanding of the supply path back to the actual publisher. In a case where there's potentially multiple hops of resale between different ad networks, it becomes very difficult to trust that there is not completely bogus traffic being inserted. So because of that, we currently do filter out a large number of what appear to be SSAI bid requests, simply because we don't have enough information to trust them. Absolutely.
Yeah, and just to reiterate that point, I mean, when you're completely at the will or the whim of an SSAI proxy server and the information being passed to you from there, especially when there's not a vast protocol or framework in place and the information being passed through such things as X forwarded for X device IP or X device user agent, it makes it extremely difficult to rely upon that information, as all of it could be spoofed. It could be it could not be a measurement event whatsoever. So to Ian's point, and also I know Jeremy made the similar points, SSAI obviously is an incredibly difficult, is very difficult to address, and it's not a one-size-fits-all solution. You can't take the position of just wholly whitelisting entire SSAI proxy servers without any other additional considerations, because at any point those same proxy servers could become proponents of fraudulent traffic. And I'll let you close this one out on that in terms of how you see the reporting limitations in SSAI. And I know you've already touched on it in terms of what the IAB Tech Lab is doing, but just want to get your take to close this one out.
Sure, and I think that all of you have already made some really good points. So I'll just focus on the directions and a change that we've been making from a standards perspective. And again, I think you made the point that it's actually quite important for people to look at WAS4 for better support of SSAI, right? So that's where we provide the direction for how to handle the X device user agent, X device IP, and such, which of course is doable with older versions of WAS as well, but that's part of WAS 4.x. But probably the more interesting one is a macro that we have defined in WAS 4.1 or 2, 4.1, I think, is the server-side macro. That's the name of the macro. And that's the one where you indicate whether the signal is coming from the client, is it coming from the server on behalf of and based on a client signal, or it's just coming from the server side, just without a signal from the client. So this is all about transparency. Obviously, the trust part is still something that has to be figured out in the chain. But these are the building blocks that we are providing to help with that. The other piece, I think, is something that that we are working on right now, the user agent guidance, which hopefully should help. One of the things that we heard was that it has been a bit of a challenge to really understand user agents, because in some cases there are some challenges around that and how the user agent is structured. So we're trying to provide some guidance around that as well. The last point I want to make there is from an open measurement point of view. Currently, we actually do have SSAI support in open measurement, but that does require a client to be in place. So we do have. I don't think I can name the companies that have done that just yet. I got to check that. But there is support for SSAI when there is an open measurement client. What we are looking at right now in the OTT technical working group is how what our options are for when we have devices that are not that capable, right? That cannot plan for an SDK around there. And that does cover a lot of the OTT space, and we are working on figuring out what can be done over there.
Absolutely, it's great to hear how everything's evolving from that side of things. So moving on to the next question, and I'll start with Ian for this. What do you feel are the differences between various SSAI proxy operators, and how do those differences, in your opinion, impact quality?
Well, one of the differences, or one of the challenges right now, is it's actually fairly difficult to identify, in the absence of a declaration, it's fairly difficult to identify who the SSAI vendor is. You know, the most obvious path would be, all right, well, maybe there's known IP address ranges that are the servers of a certain vendor of SSAI technology. Well, slight difficulty there. A lot of them are in the cloud. They're on AWS or something like that, which makes it very difficult to distinguish between an SSAI vendor, a legitimate one in the cloud, versus somebody setting up a server on Amazon EC2 that costs $1 a day to generate fake requests. So that is something of an open area for me. Another matter is some publishers implement their own SSAI technology, and that's more of a concern for me, because I see it like this: at least if the SSAI function is performed by a known vendor who has, it's very tricky to get it right and not break serve the wrong ad or do that sort of thing. A known SSAI vendor should know how to do that already, and additionally, they don't have as direct of an incentive. Let's say we remove all of the indirect sale out of the equation, and we know that we're getting the supply directly from the publisher via a good quality exchange. There's still a concern that a publisher, an evil publisher, could simply generate some extra fake traffic, and that's difficult to distinguish in an SSAI environment. And I think that's a bigger risk when the publisher operates their own technology for SSAI.
Absolutely. Jeremy, let me turn it over to you to get your take on this.
Yeah, I would agree with Ian. I think for us, I think the two big things are understanding the vendor, the proxy that they're working with, because there's a whole host of different partners that they leverage. And the other is the differences in between the client side and server side pixel firing, because that makes a big difference in terms of the quality of the data. I also think there's other kind of unrelated issues around things like being able to properly render the vast document and things like wrapper limitations and those types of things which are unique to each of these different SSAI vendors. So those are the things that we're constantly looking at. And again, it's part of the onboarding process so that we can make sure that we see a match between what's declared in the request, whether headers or parameters, and then what ultimately makes its way in the impression.
Absolutely. And then, I'll let you close it out. And I know that the next question, it kind of coincides with this in terms of fraud as well. So.
I think that I'll actually close. I think that Ian and Jeremy have covered a lot of the fraud and measurement related things. So I'm going to close this out by talking a little bit about the creative itself, right? I think one of the things that everyone should be looking at is how does that proxy handle creatives, right? So do they use the mezzanine files? Do they use a universal ad ID to track things? Do they check for the VPaid presence of VPaid or other a non-VPaid media file, so that they are sure to reduce the vast rendering. So those are the things that definitely should be a part of the assessment, I would say.
Absolutely. So let me turn it over to the next question, which obviously coincides with the last one. And I'll start with Jeremy on this one. In terms of when SSAI is used, what do you consider the most concerning fraud risk factors?
Well, I think it's what we've kind of covered here. I think it's the declaration of transparent information about the client. I think what is important to us is that more than 95% of the supply that we work with is direct relationships with partners, specifically on CTV. So I think ensuring that they're playing fairly and that they're being transparent about the information that they're sharing with us and that ultimately makes it to the exchange is incredibly important. I think from a risk factor perspective, I think it's also about communicating that transparency around SSAI out to all of the demand partners and to all of the players in the ecosystem so that they can properly differentiate when SSAI is used and when it's not. So I think those are probably the biggest risk factors. I think where we're looking for, where we're excited about, I think, is things like appads.txt. You know, the framework supports it. So I think as that makes its way to more CTV, we'll get more transparency, which of course requires some industry buy-in. But I think transparency is key. I think everybody has to play fairly and share the right information.
Absolutely, very well put. And Ian, I'll turn it over to get your take.
Sure. So I definitely want to make a distinction because I think something that's routinely misunderstood in this discussion about SSAI and fraud is I'm not talking about the case where it's a known broadcaster and they're working with Teleria or another major exchange, and everything makes sense from a business perspective. It's concerning as a DSP to not have direct access to the client device to measure it directly, but the risk factor is much smaller here. The significant risk comes when we talk about cases of resale where the supply chain is indirect. It's an ad network that sits on the exchange. And because as it currently stands, it's fairly trivial to simply misrepresent and claim you're selling inventory for an app or a connected TV channel that you're not. And combined with SSAI, or rather combined with creating the appearance of SSAI, fake SSAI, it would be fairly easy to generate quite a lot of fraud and get away with it if people aren't paying attention too closely. So in the absence of a mechanism to directly touch the client device, the next best options here are enhanced ability to verify supply chain trust, business trust, and that does mean appads.txt, which, by the way, is technically capable of functioning on Amazon Fire TV apps right now. But much more needs to happen there to have a comprehensive support across the connected TV ecosystem. We need buy-in from the stores to publish the meta tags on the App Store pages. In some cases, we need app stores to actually have web pages for the apps so that DSPs can go and discover information. Because letting the publisher declare who their authorized supply paths are is one of the quickest and most effective ways to narrow the opportunity here, so that the only people who can say that they're selling inventory for that app are the people that the publisher says is allowed to. And that's currently not the case, not without appads.txt in place. Otherwise, upcoming improvements like sellers JSON and supply chain will enable better auditing of the supply chain. Yeah, and otherwise, I think there's still some open stuff to be done with regards to specifications that deal with the security element. I think often ad tech has made the same mistake that happened on the broader internet, which is at the beginning it was assumed, oh well, this is a network for a trusted ecosystem of people. We'll transmit everything non-secure, and then later people realize there's evil people on the internet, and we need to start securing all of our communications. And similar has happened with ad tech protocols, where it's assumed, yes, this is a protocol for use by a known broadcaster to do business with a known agency. But the problem is, without a security consideration, there's opportunities for bad actors to take advantage, and those are some things that we need to close as an industry, I think.
Absolutely. And that said, just for purposes of time, I'm going to move on to the next question and let Amit kick us off, because I believe it heavily coincides with the last one. But just in terms of what we can do moving forward, how we can come together to really improve transparency and quality across channels that are utilizing SSAI. I really just wanted to get your take. And I know this is exactly what you're working on a day-to-day basis, so would really love to let you kick it off.
Yeah, and my answer is going to be very obvious, right? So I'm definitely going to say that the best thing that we can do is really to make that move to the new VAS4 based stack, right? So VAS4 along with Omid and Civet, I think that's going to be very important for the industry and for the success of SSAI, really. And again, this again covers all the different things that we already talked about. Quality of the creative itself, transparency around how things are functioning, both from a ad request macro perspective, but also from a beaconing point of view and measurement point of view. And again, this is and the last. I also want to. I know that this has not been the focus of the area, but I think it is also important from an interactive perspective to really move to that new VAS4 based stack. So that's the main thing that that I'd recommend. And I'll finally say that this is and this is a nut that we're trying to crack right now. It is still, even though it's been around for a while, it is still something that we are seriously looking at over the last couple of years. And so there is a lot of work that we are currently doing in the working groups to find the issues, make sure that we get to solutions that we can apply to the industry. So definitely ask for people to get involved.
Absolutely. And Ian, I know you touched on a lot of these points in your last answer, but I'd love to hear you give kind of your holistic take on this as well.
Well, I'll quote somebody I know whose opinion I value. I believe in spec leadership, not thought leadership. So I'm not, just wanting to talk about this. I actually do want to do things about this, and I think the best venue for that, for anybody with ideas on how to improve the security aspect, would be either some of the working groups that Amit leads in Tech Lab, or as it pertains to real-time bidding, the OpenRTB working group is a great opportunity to advance security and transparency protocols for real-time bidding related SSAI behavior.
Absolutely. And Jeremy, I'll let you close this out on this. And I know we have a few questions. Well, we have a lot of questions from the audience, but I think we've made a selection of questions for you guys after.
Great. Yeah, I think it's what the group has said. I think in terms of transparency and quality and what we can do together, I think, for Amit, it's adoption of, VAS 4.1 and ultimately VAS 4.2 and things like the SSAI flag. So there's transparency when that's used. We know this isn't going away. More and more publishers are adopting SSAI, so we need to continue to build solutions that provide that transparency. I also think putting a premium on buying direct, right? Kind of removing those resellers from the equation. But Ads.txt has been great for desktop, where there's accountability and real understanding of who you're purchasing from. And I think as we see that adopted more and more on of course, mobile in-app, but also CTV, again, it leads to better transparency for the buyers.
Absolutely. So with that, and I appreciate all the points you guys have made over the course of this presentation, but we have had quite a lot of questions from the audience, so I'd love to dive right in if you guys are up for it. So right off the bat, I think this is a perfect question for Amit to kick off with. The question is support for VAS 4.1 required from end to end, being from the video player to the ad server to the SSP, DSP, creative vendor, essentially all intermediary parties? Or are some intermediaries able to get away with not supporting VAS 4.x?
That's an interesting question. I guess it all really comes down to how fragmented we really want the industry to be, right? So arguably we can backport things like even open measurement can be supported on VAS 2 and 3 using an extension. You can implement macros on VAS 2 and 3 as well. You can take the guidelines for headers and put that onto VAS 2 and 3. But that would basically mean that you are not entirely sure whether the other side is also going to be able to support what you're expecting, right? So and that's the reason why definitely it's better if you implement. Actually, the way I look at it is that if you're going to implement something like the extension for VAS 2 and 3 for open measurement, you might as well also implement a VAS 4 version which supports that, and have that ready. It's really not a huge incremental effort to do that. But the key, I think, is that it's only with VAS 4 can you actually expect for things like VPAID to go away, right? So that's the only version that has the map, the path, the roadmap to a better future, if you will.
And one follow-up question to that, actually, that I think builds off of it very nicely is, how can the industry overall coordinate efforts to get everyone moving towards VAS 4.1 and above now, or essentially at the same time, is the question that was asked.
Right. Oh, and actually, I'll answer that. But one important thing I forgot to mention, just like VPAID, the concept of mezzanine file is not something that's there in VAS 2 and 3. So it definitely requires VAS 4 to support that. As far as coordination and how the industry can get there, I think the key really is to have a roadmap which is incremental, right? So I know that the biggest challenge is the amount of effort and making sure that you have the right business drivers, really the revenue drivers, to make that change, right? So I think there are probably two things that I look at. One is education. I think it is something that's it's important for everyone in the industry to really understand what the benefits are of moving to this new stack. And the second part is having a real practical roadmap to get there. So I think that those are the two things that are important.
Very good points. And I do have a very open-ended question for anyone who feels like chiming in first. The question is, what are the types of publisher signals you look for to make concrete determinations that an impression is coming from an SSAI environment or an SSAI proxy server? If the SSAI server is properly passing device info, be it the IP or the user agent, what are the other telltale signs that it's SSAI? And furthermore, what about the determinations in terms of client-initiated versus server-initiated impression recording? So very open-ended question. I know at Pixalate we have our own take on all this, but I'd love to get anyone's take if you're willing.
So Ian here. This is transparency into this is generally not available before making a bidding decision on almost every major exchange right now. That said, when you serve the impression, you'll detect if it's server-side beaconing. You're going to generally see that the tracking events are fired by a server in a IP address range that's known to be a data center. It's going to be like AWS or something like that. That's one of the biggest things that would make the traffic look like SSAI.
Yeah, I would just, this is Jeremy from Telaria. I would just echo that typically the telltale describer of that is in the request to our platform. Obviously the use of X-Forward, we're realizing they're passing on a client-side IP, or the use of a HTTP parameter, like an override parameter that specifies that client IP. Typically in a client-side request, we would just pull from the standard headers of IP and user agent.
Absolutely, and I appreciate both of your takes. With that said, I know we're approaching the hour mark, so we're going to wrap this up, but just wanted to let everyone know on the call that we are going to be having a blog post recapping all of this, and we are also going to make the recording available to everyone. But I just want to thank all of our panelists. I know we could sit here and discuss SSAI until we're each blue in the face, but it was great having you all on, and we really appreciate it, and we're really happy for everyone that was able to attend today.